think we have heard about climate change over and over again, not only in this get-together, but throughout the years. We had so many COPs, we have so many discussions. I send my staff every year to participate in COPs, especially in the technology transfer sessions. And usually coming back to report to me that not much has been agreed. I think we have to face the fact that this is something that the global community would have to deal with, would have to manage, and would have to do something. Whether we are convinced or not, many countries, including Thailand, are facing something real, something that a lot of times can be connected to climate change, and something that affects our population at large. So we will be prepared, we will face the consequence, no matter what COP's result would come out, because it's happening every day. Let me tell you that 4 years ago we had what we call a century flood, and it took us over a month to get over the consequence. The government was practically shut down. Many industries are affected, especially at the outskirts of Bangkok, got their heavy equipment drowned in their first floor and basement. Even automobile companies, large ones, there are pictures of many hundreds of newly assembled cars lying beneath the water. Most, if not all of which, had to be destroyed after the flood. We were afraid at that time that as a consequence of that big flood, many big industries, especially multinational companies that have their bases in Thailand for many decades, would move out of our country because of this big flood. So it's something real. It's not something that we imagine, and it's something that the government, whatever government, has to cope with. And the situation at that time, if you were in some of the situations, it's very hectic, it's very confusing, especially the first few weeks. So many agencies involved, so many data to believe or not believe. And at the end, we come to the conclusion that something needs to be implemented. A lot of corporations need to be weaved together. Maybe at some point, we need to have some sort of a single command office to handle this. So this is experience that have passed us and hopefully would not come back, but we cannot be sure. This year we have another story. We have drought, and we expect that it will hit us pretty badly. The drought comes in many styles. Partly it's historical, because drought does not only mean no rain or less rain this year, but it also refers to water management system in the past few years. Water in the dam, especially large dams, some of which have only 30 or 40% water left. AIT should know that very well about this. Drought also affects us because of the farming system. We have annual crops, especially Thailand as rice grower, but we also have off-season crops. We have off-season crops of rice. And a lot of times, in normal days, normal years, the government would not have any objection to off-season crop, because it's something that would bring revenues, additional revenues to farmers. But government also realized that we cannot let this go on naturally in abnormal years, especially when apparently drought is coming from forecasting, from all the atmospheric figuring out. But this is social issue. It's not only environmental issue. How can you tell the farmers not to do something to get revenues? You cannot. The harsh way is to say there's no water for you for your off-season crop, which is not so nice as a government to speak to farmers. But the reality is there's no water. As a government, it's a very, very tough situation indeed. How the government can assist, how the government can help in this difficult situation. To add to more confusion and problems, here comes brackish water. The salt water is seeping in with the fresh water. And it starts to affect not only the agriculture, but the livelihood. For example, water used in hospital cannot be brackish. Something that we also have to cope with. So the government at the moment is trying very hard to address this particular issue with the initial initiatives in order to help the population, especially in the north and the northeast. We have encouraged community levels to look into building or digging the so-called retention ponds. In Thailand, we call it monkey cheeks. The retention ponds in community level will certainly help at the micro scale irrigation. And it also would help the communities to work together in order to come up with a longer term and more sustainable water, community level water management system. I encourage you to, if you have time, to go into some of the rural areas where they have been very successful in controlling or in administering their annual water system. One community in Buriram province suffered from drought, from floods for over 40 years. After they have learned, especially through best practices, technologies that they can deploy. And when you talk about technology, we are not just talking about appropriate technology. High technology can also be involved in rural development. In this case, it's a village called Ban Lim Tong. And you go there and you see villagers looking at satellite images, showing their colleagues or neighboring villages how to use satellite images and aerial images in order to identify how water flow in times of flood. They can also take you to a concrete road built specifically to address this. In normal days, this particular street can be used for vehicles, for passengers, for cargo. In flood days, the village agreed totally that no cars will be allowed. It's the waterway, it's the floodway. And this street has many branches, exits, some of which would go into the monkey cheeks, some into each individual fields, and a lot will go to the central reservoirs. They also face the problem of the dirt and the gravels that would fill up their reservoirs after after a period of time. So the villagers come up with innovative ideas of digging a small pond in order to trap these gravels or this dirt before entering the big reservoirs, because they cannot handle digging the big reservoir every year. So things like this is something that we need to realize, that it's not only central planning, but it's also how to encourage villages, communities to get together and solve their problems with the help of the central knowledge, central technologies, for instance. We also need to look at our groundwater more, even though we know that we should not do too many of them. But in this kind of crisis, groundwater is one of the solutions. The desalination system, and even the examination of alternative crops that consume little or less water to replace the rice growing is something that we also need to do. Apart from this, the water conservation, of course. Certainly, this is just one of the examples that Thailand would try to do more and get the whole communities involved. Now, we also have listened to so many contents about climate change. IPCC have been telling us about the degree rise in global temperature, 2% centigrade, 2 degrees centigrade. If we are careful, above 2 degrees centigrade if we are not careful. Climate change also features among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG, which are a proposed set of targets relating to future international development. SDG 13 recommends to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The World Economic Forum 2014 also reports failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation among the global risks of highest concern. Even in Europe, in 2011, climate change was a major cause of concern for the European public, identified by the Eurobarometer survey conducted in that year, which revealed that the majority of Europeans believe that climate change is the second most serious issue facing the world after poverty, hunger, and lack of drinking water, and a more serious problem than the economic situation. I don't know whether this is true today. Let me also highlight the fact that at the regional level, a number of studies, especially that reported by ADB, suggest that Southeast Asia is one of the vulnerable regions in the world to climate change, and probably one of the most vulnerable if we talk about ASEAN plus 6, which amount to half of the world population. The consequence of climate change for Asia and Pacific, as identified by ADB, consists of a number of items. For example, decreasing freshwater availability, particularly in large river basins. And Mekong River is a case in point that we have to be careful because it involves the livelihood of 4 or 5 countries along the river. The rising sea levels, as you well know, the increasing risk of flooding in coastal areas, the growing pressures for large-scale migration, jeopardizing sources of livelihood, particularly for the poor in highly vulnerable areas, increasing health risks from heat waves, vector-borne diseases, and water shortages and contamination, as well as deepening economic damage from the combined and cumulative effects of these impacts. Coming from the Ministry of Science and Technology, let me highlight just a few things that we have been doing in response to climate change. During these past 2 years, we have involved ourselves in the so-called technology needs assessment for climate change. And we have come up with 4 areas of technology needs that Thailand deemed important to our not only economic but also social development. Let me name a few. When we talk about mitigation of climate change, Thailand is very much concerned with agricultural sector. And here we want to do at least 3 things. One is precision farming technologies, planting the right seed in the right place at the right time. We need also to do crop improvement technologies, adapting plants to the effects of climate change. And in agriculture, it will be most useful if we have the forecasting and early warning system. Technologies would help to decide on the timing of specific farming at the seasonal forecast. Secondly, Thailand thinks that water resource management is very important. And here we want to do 3 things. One is networking and management of infrastructure. 2 is seasonal climate prediction. And this will involve numerical models for analysis or forecast of weather, surface and groundwater runoffs and levels, and water quality as well. We also need to do sensor web using observation and modeling data. This is some kind of warning technology which is necessary to prepare appropriate response to mitigate disaster impact. The third item that we think is important is modeling capability. We need to have good data center. We need to have data transfer, and especially the synthesis or the collection of data from several agencies together as one, and have a single evaluation or analysis for decision-making system. We also need to have advanced research, weather research and forecasting research. Last but not least, we also look into energy sector, and this in particular would address more mitigation than adaptation. Here we have 4 items that we think will be useful for Thailand for the energy sector to cope with climate change. First one is with regard to smart grid. The combination of power system and telecommunication system, making it more intelligent for us to make sure that we use our energy efficiently. Second is biofuels. Many major companies in Thailand nowadays is facing something very strange. For example, in the sugarcane industry, the sugar company has been enjoying very good export of sugar, but not today. Today, about half of their revenues come from biofuels, from bagasse. So things can change, as one of you have mentioned about disruptive. And disruptive technology is also another thing that we have to keep in mind. Third item is with regard to high efficiency boiler. This is purely technical. But to make sure that it's efficient would mean that so many boilers in the country would help save energy. Last but not least, the so-called carbon capture and storage, or CCS, technology and process for capturing carbon dioxide from large point source, such as fossil fuel power plants, transporting it to a storage site, depositing it where it will not enter the atmosphere. Having said all this, I'd like to conclude by saying that according to my observation, what human being is addressing at the moment comes very close to what His Majesty the King of Thailand has offered to the Thai population, the so-called sufficiency economy philosophy. The reason I say this is because I feel that what we are dealing with is pretty much trying to attain the middle path. And by sufficiency economy, His Majesty refers to 3 pillars of thinking. The first pillar is moderation. Not to do too little, not to do too much. By the way, sufficiency economy does not mean that we need to be poor, we can be rich, but at a moderation level. And moderation, not at the expense of oneself, and not at the expense of others. Second pillar is the so-called reasonableness or due consideration. We do things rationally. We concern not only outputs, but also outcomes. The third pillar is with regard to immunity from both internal and external shocks. This can be applied not only climate change, financial shocks we have encountered for so many times in the past few decades. And by immunity, we talk about be prepared, keeping moderation intact, doing things with reasonableness, and all these have to come with knowledge and with moral or virtue. And by moral and virtue, we are talking about honesty. We need to be honest when we talk about climate change. We need to be patient. It takes a long time for many things to happen or not happen. We have to be diligent, and last but not least, using our wisdom. Thank you very much for your attention.